One of the easiest intellectual pitfalls to fall into is the one that I am going to call the moderation fallacy. The moderation fallacy is the idea that, all other things being equal, the middle of two other political positions is always the best and most reasonable position that one can take. Some people also have the unfortunate tendency to define whatever position they hold as moderate, and existing in a magical Goldilocks zone free from the extremes of anyone who disagrees to the left or to the right to even the slightest degree. Many self-proclaimed moderates also feel that they are free from bias in some way, or that they have a more complete view of reality than their contemporaries with their sharp opinions. Self-proclaimed moderates often have a tendency to spend more time trying to put themselves in the middle of their peers than they do actually analyzing a problem and trying to figure out the best path to a solution. Since humans have a great talent for self-justification, I imagine that the moderation fallacy is as old as human speech itself. The first historical example that I'm aware of occurs in the writings of the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who lived in the early 6th century BCE. Solon wrote poetry to describe his political views and the reforms that he enacted in a bitterly divided Athens, which had appointed him as a lawgiver to settle a dispute which seems to have divided the public along class lines. We don't know much about archaic Athenian politics, so it is hard to say if Solon was actually in the middle of, or if the battle lines and issues were even what he claims them to have been. What we can tell from the later Pisistrated tyranny and the subsequent Cleisthenic reforms is that Solon's attempts at convincing everyone who was defending his own interest that they were being immoderate and unreasonable failed. Solon bragged that his reforms had satisfied no one, as if that were a signal proof of his virtue and statesmanship. To avoid going into detail on one of the most contentious topics in archaic Greek historiography, suffice it to say that by all appearances Solon corrected a few of the worst abuses, but tried to avoid all of the underlying issues that created those abuses in the first place. Aristotle's political writings send many mixed messages on what he believed to be the best form of government. It is clear that he followed Solon in upholding the central role to be played by those in the middle, whether he was thinking of the middle class in a democracy, or he was advocating for a polyarchy, the rule of many but not all, a sort of broad oligarchy or a narrow democracy. A constitution somewhere between the exclusivity of a narrow oligarchy and a radical democracy. I have little doubt that Aristotle's views were shaped by his experiences as a member of the elite, living at Philip II's court, and then living in democratic Athens. By advocating for something larger than a narrow, confined oligarchy, he could demonstrate that he was not just an advocate for his own social class, and seem serious to the opponents of oligarchy. On the other hand, Aristotle could follow elite consensus by casting scorn on the mob rule that they saw as radical democracy. Unfortunately for Aristotle, his genius was more for organization and description than problem solving. Most of the governments of the Greek polis were not stable, and almost every known revolution was either in favor of a narrow oligarchy where the rich were trying to assert their dominance, or a broad radical democracy where the people were trying to assert their rights to participate as citizens. Polyarchy, while interesting to Greek political philosophers, was not a viable solution to the greater problems of political instability and factionalism. It is disappointing that Aristotle allowed himself to fall prey to the moderation fallacy, given what he had written about finding the golden mean in his Nicomachean Ethics. In that great work, Aristotle had observed that the ideal point between two opposite character traits is not always in the direct center, but can lay much closer to one node than the other. Applying such a notion to politics, I will take it 2 steps further. 1. The golden mean could in some circumstances lie further down the path than either dominant position allows, and 2. There are times when some of the pressing issues of political discourse are framed so poorly that solving the issue as stated is more or less a complete waste of time. In conclusion, I would like to say that one should worry more about whether one's own opinions and positions are supported by evidence and whether one's preferred solutions would make the world a better place than where one falls on an artificial political spectrum defined by others. Triangulating a central position between two unexamined positions, which might not even be framing the issue in a logical fashion, is hardly a formula for arriving at a correct conclusion. As Rowdy Roddy Piper said in the 1988 Marxist action sci-fi classic They Live, the middle of the road is the worst place to drive.